Many articles of the journal Scientific American have more often been a forthright proponent of Darwinian evolution hypotheses. It sometimes provides refuting evidence to criticize various aspects within this mainstream teaching. Problems are often highlighted as it is with any other field of scientific inquiry. Nonetheless, there are articles biased in favor of materialist evolutionism. For example, it had an article written by John Rennie on July 1, 2002 entitled, 15 Answers to Creationist Nonsense. So right off the bat, the polemical position has been stated in the title and therefore the bias of the article has already been revealed. So, that's a red flag right there. Where is the objective skepticism for the opposing view as well? Perhaps we missed something. Let's have a closer look at the language in the article and see whether it adheres to the idealism of using rational thought from fundamental first principles, or if it turns out otherwise and sometimes just goes along with the popular view. We'll examine the occasional bias and dogmatic opinion in its comments. We will play the agnostic adjudicator here, and periodically interrupt the quoted article, to highlight any biased statements that are motivated by the writer's personal beliefs. This is being done to illustrate just how insidious and misleading such loaded language can negatively affect the objectivity of public consciousness. Creationists are certainly not above criticism in this area either. But the same must be questioned about evolutionists' claims as well, and since it is recognized to be a mainstream teaching, it must be given a proportional amount of scrutiny. Rather than building a case from using fundamental reasoning, sometimes journalists fall into the trap of going down the popularized narratives and mainstream views, so that they may gain the approval of their peers, but in the process, they sacrifice sound judgment and cheat their readers. Looking at an article in a well-known service like Scientific American is noteworthy because it is a reasonable example of the amount of biased, or non-biased reporting, that mainstream journalism of this type is capable of. Let's see. To begin with, let's look more closely at the misleading title. 15 Answers to Creationists' Nonsense. Firstly, as we look further at this article, you will notice that not all of his 15 answers are dealing with nonsense, but are answering some very legitimate concerns about parts within the evolution theory, so that's misleading. Secondly, you will notice that any nonsense he talks about is straw man arguments, blanket statements, false equivocations, conflated reasoning, bait and switch fallacies, to suit his particular narrative. Unwary readers might be misled into thinking that all creationists can be correctly characterized within his insinuations. It starts by saying,
opponents of evolution want to make a place for creationism by tearing down real science, but their arguments don't hold up.
Such strong language. You would imagine the evidence to justify this to be overwhelming. Do creationists want to tear down real science? It seems unlikely when many real scientists themselves are creationists whose research has benefited society in various ways, such as the invention of the MRI machine, the gene gun, etc. Is he implying that all such creationist opponents of the theory are anti-scientific, or that their science is not real? It's a rather blanket statement. As expected, there is already a claim being made here, implying all of Darwinian evolution to be real science, and that arguments against it don't hold up. We shall see. So right off the bat, you can already see how loaded with bias his statements are. People quite often tend to assume when reading these kinds of proclamations that the evidence for certain believed types of evolution are extraordinarily strong, and therefore perhaps they don't question it any further, but we are going to question it further. All theories must be questioned about the evidence that is used to support them. Scientists generally understand this. There are no exceptions to this rule. The article written in 2002 continues,
when Charles Darwin introduced the theory of evolution through natural selection 143 years ago, the scientists of the day argued over it fiercely, but the massing evidence from paleontology, genetics, zoology, molecular biology and other fields, gradually established evolution's truth, beyond reasonable doubt. Today, that battle has been won, everywhere, except in the public imagination.
We see two more claims. Firstly, that evolution has been established as true, beyond reasonable doubt. So, we must examine then, if, and why, there are scientists who still doubt parts of it. We also need to decide as to whether such doubting of some Darwinian concepts is still reasonable or not, in this day and age of scientific achievements. Secondly, he states that the battle has been won, whatever that means, but not in the public imagination. Not yet an explanation here either. It would seem that the public, as the writer acknowledges, doubt it also, by and large. Of course, some people are unreasonable when either doubting or believing, but this argument is superfluous in that it has no bearing on the theory's validity in scientific terms. Why be overly concerned about consensus? We don't want dogma born out of popularity, we want scientifically testable evidence. He says,
embarrassingly, in the 21st century, in the most scientifically advanced nation the world has ever known, creationists can still persuade politicians, judges, and ordinary citizens that evolution is a flawed, poorly supported fantasy.
So, should people feel embarrassed because they are skeptical of certain aspects within evolution theory and demand convincing evidence? How poorly or well supported is it? Are we allowed to question it? It's controversial who should be embarrassed at this point when simply asking for scientific evidence. The truth of an idea is independent of political self-opinionated ideological dogma or personal beliefs. If evolution is not a poorly supported fantasy, then we should be able to appeal to conclusive reproducible evidence. The most scientifically advanced nation still gives creationism an unbiased hearing, which probably has something to do with rationality, basic human rights, and freedom of speech. So instead of being embarrassed, such a scientifically advanced people should be commended for allowing different views to be expressed without suppression, and open to transparent, rigorous investigation. Don't you think? Skepticism, refutation, and falsifiability are tenets of science. Do we want the rules of science to change just to satisfy a cancel culture of some kind, and to exclude someone's arguments without the principle of total evidence? Trying to underhandedly embarrass the person you are debating with, in a thinly veiled way, is not uncommon of course. However, it doesn't necessarily do anything for rationality and objectivity. His objection is,
they lobby for creationist ideas such as intelligent design to be taught as alternatives to evolution in science classrooms. As this article goes to press, the Ohio Board of Education is debating whether to mandate such a change. Some anti-evolutionists, such as Philip P. Johnson, a law professor at the University of California at Berkeley, and author of Darwin on Trial, admit that they intend for intelligent design theory to serve as a wedge for reopening science classrooms to discussions of God. Besieged teachers and others may increasingly find themselves on the spot to defend evolution and refute creationism. The arguments that creationists use are typically specious and based on misunderstandings of, or outright lies about, evolution, but the number and diversity of the objections can put even well-informed people at a disadvantage.
Were classrooms in the past open to discussions of God? If they were, then apparently it reached a point where this no longer happens. Or does it? We have still not discussed the evidence, but ideology instead, and now the ad hominem arguments that some evolutionists often seem to make are appearing. He says that creationists are typically liars. We shall see. Are all the arguments put forth by all creationists typically specious, that is to say, false, hollow, erroneous, baseless, or inaccurate? Is that really typical of their arguments? This is another sweeping statement, which is self-refuting, because logically maybe some are, but probably not all. And it's not as though evolutionists don't make similar dogmatic errors from time to time. And what is so wrong about having to defend evolution against the diversity of the objections? Does he think the doctrine to be unquestionable? Either something is irrefutable or it's not. The very idea of peer review is built upon this accepted principle. The adage, if you can't take the heat, then get out of the kitchen, might well apply here. Or does he think we should just accept the dogma without rigorous questioning? Is it that sacred? Is that how we do science? Is that how journalism is done? Is the concept of peer review circling the drain? If science has established evolution's truth beyond reasonable doubt, should not the evidence speak for itself and stand up to the diversity of the objections? Does all this in his article bespeak journalistic integrity and unbiased objectivity? Philip E. Johnson, 1940 to 2019, being a lawyer, wrote his book From the Legal Perspective, and rightfully so. If some evolutionists, when advocating their hypotheses, were to infer that the scientific fraternity is somehow above the legal principles that are typically applied in a court of law, then such hubris would be manifestly ridiculous, because science also requires proper evidence, perhaps even more so than that found in a court of law, especially with physics and engineering principles where accuracy, safety, and human life are at stake. Nobody wants sloppy engineers to be designing bridges, skyscrapers, and airplanes, etc. Certainly, it would be appropriate to sympathize with teachers who themselves have been badly trained with incomplete information on Darwinism and creationism, and this seems like a failure of a narrow-minded educational system letting teachers down, although it might seem reasonable to think that the best institutions would be up to date with it. When speaking about creationists' objections to evolution, we read,
to help with answering them, the following list rebuts some of the most common scientific arguments raised against evolution. It also directs readers to further sources for information and explains why creation science has no place in the classroom.
Does the Darwinian story of how mindless upward development supposedly happened in the remote past equally not have any place in the classroom, within his narrative? Or is he biased? Should we also view the idea of mindless upward evolution as a religious belief system that has no place in the science room? So once again we see his opinion of how to define science and how it should be taught. One would rightly expect the evidence to be conclusive, with little room for doubt to support such intrepid statements about all of Darwin's evolution theory being real. So let us see if this strong language is empirically justified. Some parts of the theory have been proven real, but what about the rest of it? Are such objections put forth by creationists against Darwinian evolution scientific? How does he feel about this next objection?
1. Evolution is only a theory. It is not a fact or a scientific law.
Many people learned in elementary school that a theory falls in the middle of a hierarchy of certainty, above a mere hypothesis but below a law. Scientists do not use the terms that way, however. According to the National Academy of Sciences, NAS, a scientific theory is a well-substantiated explanation of some aspect of the natural world that can incorporate facts, laws, inferences, and tested hypotheses. No amount of validation changes a theory into a law, which is a descriptive generalization about nature. So when scientists talk about the theory of evolution, or the atomic theory, or the theory of relativity, for that matter, they are not expressing reservations about its truth.
Certainly, no credible biologist disputes the observable process of natural selection of genetic variations within interbreeding populations or gene pools. But it is an extraordinary claim when saying that the overall Darwinian evolution theory is a well-substantiated explanation for the creation of the whole natural world to the same degree as relativity and atomic theory are for calculating outcomes. If scientists don't use the terms hypothesis, theory, and law the same way that people were taught them, that might be a definition problem that is creating confusion. It seems unlikely that scientists would be trying to create such confusion, instead of being committed to making scientific knowledge and their research as understandable as possible, for it to be perceived as useful. You will notice more and more that some people often like to redefine the meaning of certain words to suit their narrative, instead of using the word as it has been historically commonly accepted and understood. Sometimes definitions of words need changing. The word planet has undergone a redefinition recently because of new scientific evidence to support it, although still somewhat arbitrary. It is justifiable from indisputable rigorous observations. But then other cases are not justified by anything empirical. For example, the words entropy and nothing, when accepted in the way that they are commonly understood, pose problems for the materialist forms of atheism. And so atheists might narrow the definition of such words to accommodate their unproven hypothetical imagination. This is not equivalent to redefining the word planet. But either way, redefining words in itself proves nothing. It ultimately comes down to experimental evidence. What do you mean when using words like information, entropy, or complexity? A hypothesis is an imagined explanation of a phenomenon that needs to be tested. It's just a fancy word for a guess. A theory is an imagined explanation that has been tested and so far agrees with reality and has become useful as a tool for science or some other discipline. It is a language that can explain phenomena in terms that we can understand, and used to calculate consequences. A scientific law, what is that? Laws in science, or the laws of physics, are mathematical descriptions of repeatable effects. They do not provide us with a proven explanation of the cause. We often assume the cause to be a force of some sort. But we may not know what that force really is, or what the cause of it is. A force is a story we invent to make sense of the observed repeatable effects that we can measure. And so we call it a law, because our notion of its unchangeable nature is not yet proven wrong, but we have no good explanation for why it is never wrong and never different, and so why a law is the way that it is. We do not exactly know, and this is a great mystery for science. Probably by far, the best explained law of science is the second law of thermodynamics. It can be accounted for in more detail than other laws using statistical principles. Einstein was maybe one who even came close to being able to explain a force, and yet even despite this, no one has discovered a grand unified theory of everything, where all the forces and constants of nature have one simple mathematical description. This aspiration has often been regarded as the holy grail of theoretical physics. And to that, we can only say, we wish those physicists whatever good luck possible in the universe. And some speculate that one day, that in this way, we might be able to explain the nature of existence itself. Do we just accept someone else's definition of a fact without looking at it for ourselves? That would be a lack of critical thinking. Is the article painting the true picture here? So far, we have not addressed evidence, just the meaning of words, consensus, and belief. And yet it continues. He says,
in addition to the theory of evolution, meaning the idea of descent with modification, one may also speak of the fact of evolution. The NAS defines a fact as an observation that has been repeatedly confirmed, and for all practical purposes, is accepted as true. The fossil record, and abundant other evidence, testify that organisms have evolved through time. Although no one observed those transformations, the indirect evidence is clear, unambiguous and compelling.
Is it possible for indirect evidence to be completely unambiguous? Is such faith justified? To the casual reader, this Darwinist argument might sound convincing. But have all parts within Darwinian evolution been proven factual? No. By whom has it been accepted as true? What supporting observations have been repeatedly confirmed, other than just similarities, and natural selection of already existing genes and their mutations? Is that the abundant evidence he refers to? And for what practical purposes exactly has it been accepted as the truth? There are certain Darwinian concepts that have been proven true. We can legitimately say that microevolution is certainly a fact, because it can be observed as it is happening right now, before our eyes, and so it has been repeatedly confirmed, by humans for thousands of years, in fact, long before it was ever given the label microevolution. But this is not true of the imagined macroevolution idea. The imagined, so far unobserved, uphill transformations, speculated within the macroevolution concept, where new functional genetic information and biological novelty is imagined to be created somehow by blind natural causes involving natural selection, are not proven fact, and so too when it comes to the fossils. Creationists are quick to agree that no one observed those transformations, if indeed there were any such naturally caused uphill transformations in the first place, as one could equally speculate that they never happened, or existed at all, and speculate that this is why we find no definitive trace of certainly imagined intermediates in the fossil record, and we could ask if there might be certain ways of testing that idea. We might ask why we only observe certain discrete punctuated forms in various types, without intermediates, both in the fossils and their living counterparts today, and then ask if this is what we would expect to see from a gradualistic upward evolutionary process. There are good rational grounds to dispute the evolutionists' interpretation of the fossils found, and point out that the record is either 1. Incomplete, or 2. In many cases such believed transitional fossils never existed, and therefore the fossil record might be more complete than what is believed. But the fossils alone might not be able to tell us definitively which idea is true, although it might be possible to find a trend one way or the other. Either way, you haven't proven much, but are only relying on arguments from similarities, which leaves it wide open to interpretation. For example, despite many objections, some creationists speculate that much of the suddenness of it might be evidence for the well-known biblical flood of Genesis. There seems not a good enough logical reason to exclude this, as an alternative model for scientific investigation, unless it can be proven 100% wrong beyond all doubt. Many qualified scientists think this not to be the case. Scientists are on record as saying that there is no conclusive evidence in the fossil record that testifies to these organisms having evolved through time, by small gradual successive steps in the macroevolutionary sense, and instead we see what is referred to as punctuated equilibrium, a term which acknowledges the sudden appearances of fully developed complex creatures with few if any fossils that could be speculated to be gradual intermediate steps, and also that the observable evidence of today's living things only testify to them being modified in a microevolutionary way, that is by genetic variation of offspring, natural selection, and sometimes an observed degenerative mutation. Even dinosaur bones that were believed to be over 65 million years old are often being found with soft tissue still preserved in them, which is upsetting for certain people. The word fact apparently means different things to different people, even different scientists, and he doesn't specify in his statement which aspect of the overall Darwinian theory he is talking about. Microevolution, abiogenesis, or macroevolution? Microevolution is not particularly controversial, but many scientists are critically skeptical toward the ideas of abiogenesis and macroevolution. If the indirect evidence is unambiguous and compelling, then why are qualified scientists, critics, and skeptics of these specific facets? The answer is simple. Because they are scientists, and that is what scientists do. They question and test things until properly proven or disproven. That is how science works. This type of evidence does not characterize something as being absolute proven irrefutable fact in this case. As to what they mean by repeatedly confirmed, that is a vast area of conjecture as well. Microevolution, and similarities, and the remixing of inherited genes, are repeatedly confirmed, but what else? If novel genetic information has never been observed to begin existing, then in what way does this evidence resolve the creation versus evolution debate? How does such evidence distinguish between the macroevolution idea, or the idea of common design principles? And if it cannot, how then does this eliminate the explanatory need for an intelligent creator? One process has been seen and the other not. Intelligently guided processes of upward development have been observed in physical reality, but no one has observed any mindless naturally occurring upward development in the real world. He now asserts,
all sciences frequently rely on indirect evidence. Physicists cannot see subatomic particles directly, for instance, so they verify their existence by watching for telltale tracks that the particles leave in cloud chambers. The absence of direct observation does not make physicists' conclusions less certain.
That is true. What makes conclusions less certain is an absence of repeatability with the experiments, which is a critical oversight in his argument, something that is immediately obvious to a scientist. There are no repeatable experiments in the laboratory that have yet been done which demonstrate macroevolution or abiogenesis as being possible, and even statistical analysis involving huge numbers indicate a negative, downward trend in the known processes. Such hoped-for evidence has not been produced once, let alone repeated. Unlike macroevolution hypotheses or abiogenesis hypotheses, all those physics experiments are repeatable and give consistent results in the laboratory. Accurate predictions can be made from statistical probabilities, cause and effect analysis, and properly observed and measured. Those scientific theories of physics were also developed, in part, by constantly being subject to rigorous attempted falsification, laborious scrutiny, and critical analysis, so why should the theory of Darwinian evolution be given a free pass, with different rules? Where is the testable and fundamental mathematical argument that we can use to calculate consequences and compare with experimental results? This is one of the reasons why many think comparing Darwinists' upward evolutionary beliefs to physics is a logical error. The macroevolution hypothesis of increasing complexity is not experimentally reproducible in this way, nor the abiogenesis concept either. They have never been observed once, let alone repeated, and that is the real problem. But instead, statistically, there have been observed biological decay curves from available data and theoretical reasoning, the total opposite of what seemingly many evolutionists were hoping to prove.
2. Natural selection is based on circular reasoning. The fittest are those who survive, and those who survive are deemed fittest.
Survival of the fittest is a conversational way to describe natural selection, but a more technical description speaks of differential rates of survival and reproduction. That is, rather than labeling species as more or less fit, one can describe how many offspring they are likely to leave, under given circumstances. Drop a fast-breeding pair of small-beaked finches, and a slower-breeding pair of large-beaked finches, onto an island, full of food seeds. Within a few generations, the fast breeders may control more of the food resources. Yet if large beaks more easily crush seeds, the advantage may tip to the slow breeders. In a pioneering study of finches on the Galapagos Islands, Peter R. Grant of Princeton University observed these kinds of population shifts in the wild. See his article, Natural Selection and Darwin's Finches, Scientific American, October 1991. The key is that adaptive fitness can be defined without reference to survival. Large beaks are better adapted for crushing seeds, irrespective of whether that trait has survival value under the circumstances.
That's right, but it's a moot point, true but superfluous. It's a straw man argument. Almost nobody disputes natural selection being part of the cause for microevolution. Variation within species, something that should be obvious to any qualified biologist, even an evolutionist. It is an important and significant detail that needs to be pointed out here and not ignored. Both creationists and intelligent design advocates generally agree that microevolution, meaning variation within species, is a proven fact. Adaptive fitness is not proof that increasing complexity can come from the hypothetical ideas postulated to be within Darwinian evolution. One could easily be misled into the impression that creationists don't understand the meaning of survival of the fittest. When you read many of their articles, it is quite clear that they do. It refers to the most suitably adapted organism. So this is mostly time wasting, in the context of the creation versus evolution debate, that is, God and evolution, as competing creative forces. He only starts to admit this in the next common objection to evolution, which is
3. Evolution is unscientific, because it is not testable or falsifiable. It makes claims about events that were not observed and can never be recreated.
And to be fair, we can also say that biblical creationism makes claims about events that were not observed by any human alive at the time of this writing, and such claims cannot be recreated in the lab. By this, we specifically mean creative events, that is to say, origins.
This blanket dismissal of evolution ignores important distinctions that divide the field into at least two broad areas: microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution looks at changes within species over time, changes that may be preludes to speciation, the origin of new species. Macroevolution studies how taxonomic groups above the level of species change. Its evidence draws frequently from the fossil record and DNA comparisons to reconstruct how various organisms may be related.
Some organisms might be related. But is all the reconstruction representative of reality? Is there a blanket dismissal by creationists? It only seems to be a dismissal of one particular tenet in this argument, that being macroevolution, which is the idea that microevolutionary changes might be preludes to speciation, which in essence quite often means preludes to macroevolution, which at some point logically has to include the imagined idea of increasing functional complexity. But notice that he finally proceeds to explain it, which seems to be self-contradictory. He says,
"These days, even most creationists acknowledge that microevolution has been upheld by tests in the laboratory, as in studies of cells, plants and fruit flies, and in the field, as in Grant's studies of evolving beak shapes among Galapagos finches. Natural selection and other mechanisms, such as chromosomal changes, symbiosis, and hybridization, can drive profound changes in populations over time.
People have observed and accepted this for thousands of years. So, what did he mean then by blanket dismissal? Creationists quite often point out that natural selection might be able to explain the survival of the fittest, but not the arrival of the fittest. That is, they object to the notion that species can macroevolve from something before them. When evolutionists talk about speciation, they might not distinguish between the unproven imagined idea of upward speciation or the empirically proven fact, which is the devolution process of subspeciation. So it's not a blanket dismissal, but only a dismissal of the claims about events that were not observed and can never be recreated in the laboratory. James Arthur Harris, 1880–1930, was a botanist who worked at the Carnegie Institution and the University of Minnesota, and he was quoting from Jacob Gould Schumann's 1854–1942, when he wrote, I think I have the quotation not far from correctly stated, "Natural selection may explain the survival of the fittest, but it cannot explain the arrival of the fittest." So, microevolution is an objective truth, whereas macroevolution is anecdotally subjective. We objectively perceive the survival of the fittest, but certain people subjectively have beliefs about the arrival of the fittest. With modern genetics, evolutionists have since speculated that mutations might be the answer to explaining the arrival of the fittest, but modern genetic studies and the mapping of the human genome etc. have provided data that refutes such. The fact is, the ideology of exclusive naturalism cannot provide an adequate explanation of how the morphological innovation that is required can happen. There is not even one specific definitive observed documented example. Egotistical claims of it might sometimes be made but always refutable, and because of their intrinsic credulity and sometimes religiosity, they always tend to collapse in deepest humiliation. This is the bait-and-switch argument that creationists often complain about. Variation within species, Genetic adaptation within apparent limits has been recognized probably by nearly every human on Earth back through history. This is what has been unremarkably upheld by tests in the laboratory, and since ancient times, has been observed in millenniums of human-controlled selective breeding of animals and plants. Creationists complain that ideologically driven evolutionists will often hope that the same proof will be automatically accepted without skepticism as proof for macroevolution. Although the evolutionists don't always directly say it, they skip over it, perhaps hoping that it will subconsciously slip past anyone's notice, to evade criticism. It seems many of them don't even realize that they are doing it. But of course, it should be scrutinized, and it will be, like any scientific theory should be. We need to be rational about this. In trying to protect their argument from falsification, some people tend to muddy the definitions of, and distinctions between microevolution and macroevolution, by pointing out the difficulty in defining species, phyla, kinds, and other categories. Both creationists and evolutionists have been accused of this. But that is not where the actual distinction between the two concepts is critical from a scientific perspective. What distinguishes microevolution from macroevolution is this: microevolution is testable and observable. It is replication and reiteration in populations. So far, no new genes have been observed to come into existence. They are simply observed being recombined over successive generations via crossbreeding. Sometimes mistakes or copying errors, commonly referred to as mutations which are genetic damage, creep into the process. These are proven facts and therefore scientific. Evolutionists want to believe that some of these mutations can become new functional genes, but increased functional information beginning to exist in this manner has never been demonstrated to emerge or arise this way. We must eradicate any cognitive dissonance within ourselves of these established observational distinctions if we are to be properly scientific and eliminate any blind credulity from our thought processes. Macroevolution is not a proven fact because it has never been observed and cannot be empirically proven in the laboratory. It is the claim that new genes and new body parts can be created via natural selection and mutations. That unplanned natural processes cause increasing complexity in living things from new previously non-existent genetic information, somehow from damaged genes, and natural selection. The emergence of higher orders of information due to this known process has never been demonstrated. Such an outcome from this observed process of mutation and natural selection has never been witnessed, and therefore it does not qualify at this time as being a scientific fact. Furthermore, the speculation that it would take millions of years for there to be a noticeable upward difference means that this idea likely cannot be tested or falsified, which makes it an article of faith at best. Some evolutionists are making some serious logical errors when defining something as being scientific. They dismiss the distinction and try and credulously make the claim that microevolution and macroevolution are essentially the same. Their definition of species is designed to fit into their model, so that they then use their definition of speciation as evidence for macroevolution, even though in such cases no new information has been created but only remixed from crossbreeding or genetic damage. They are entitled to believe that it might be possible, as an act of faith, but the distinction of what is scientific and what is faith is defined by what is observable and by what is only a belief in the unobservable. The observable is a scientific fact, but the unobservable is not a scientific fact, and this is what the more dogmatic evolutionists are typically always skipping over and ignoring, which is not intellectually honest. Sometimes with physics, we know something unobservable exists, and we even give it a name because of its consistent observable effects, even though we don't exactly know what the cause is that we are naming. Gravity, dark matter, dark energy, etc., are examples of this, but the name only identifies the effects as fact, not the cause. But are scientists justified believing in a cause existing due to the empirical effects even if they can't prove what it is? Yes. Is such faith allowed in the science room? Yes. So given that any direction detected in evolution is only observed to be heading toward more disorder, what hypothesis might account for how it all began more ordered? It should be asked, does new novel functional genetic information ever begin to exist due to natural processes, or can it only become possible due to intelligent creation? For the sake of testing and challenging our beliefs, that is the honest open-minded question that needs to be addressed with appropriate skepticism if a person is trying to determine whether the idea of an intelligent creator, God, is plausible. The willful ignorance of atheism serves no purpose in this line of inquiry, but it must be approached from the default position of neutrality. Microevolution is the remixing of existing genetic information. It does not increase, and this has been numerous times a repeatedly observed fact. Macroevolution is the speculative idea that information in offspring can increase, and it has never been proven to happen in the laboratory. So, one idea is fact, and the other idea is only a belief not proven wrong, although manifestly ludicrously unlikely. So far, the science for, at most, microevolution is real. The facts for microevolution have been presented, and this is in full agreement with creationists and evolutionists. So, most people generally have been observed to have no real dispute on this particular point, other than the bait-and-switch misdirection of the argument. We must not commit the fallacy of equivocation. The ideological avoidance sometimes to acknowledge the differences between microevolution and macroevolution, what has been observed and never observed upward change, and the failure to adhere to this rigorous constraint in mainstream science, is a regular lack of discipline, which wastes time and fails to narrow down the examination to where it matters scientifically. Those who persist in perpetrating such intellectual dishonesty should, in principle, be cast out of the science room. Such definition shell games, with words, should be eliminated from the domain of empirical scientific inquiry. These bait-and-switch arguments, and conflated reasonings, can potentially slow down scientific progress in a particular field of study.
The historical nature of macroevolutionary study involves inference from fossils and DNA, rather than direct observation. Yet in the historical sciences, which include astronomy, geology, and archaeology, as well as evolutionary biology, hypotheses can still be tested by checking whether they accord with physical evidence, and whether they lead to verifiable predictions about future discoveries.
The term macroevolutionary study seems a misnomer for science. Are we studying fact or fiction in this case? Atheists might say the same thing about belief in God. But, in this sense, there cannot be any direct observation using fossils and DNA, inference to a hypothetical history based only on similarities found in fossils and DNA is not fact. What method does one use to try and falsify or verify the macroevolution hypothesis? Lab experiments? Eugenics? Many have tried and none have succeeded in proving such a concept. We must not forget why such arguments are called hypotheses, anecdotes, and just so stories. The verifiable predictions in astronomy are often far more precise and accurately constrained, in a way that is far beyond anything in the macroevolution hypothesis, and the same is usually true about its predictions of future discoveries. But wrong theories can still make correct predictions, and until we see repeatable experiments such things remain inconclusive. The journalist rightly refers to such things being called hypotheses or guesses, and he didn't compare it to physics this time, although making comparisons to astronomy is very tenuous. Theories in astronomy make use of theoretical physics. All those historical sciences are continually questioned and meticulously scrutinized. But then the writer's objectivity is lost once more, in saying,
for instance, evolution implies that between the earliest known ancestors of humans, roughly 5 million years old, and the appearance of anatomically modern humans, about 100,000 years ago.
Which is another dogmatic faith-based statement based on the ape-to-human doctrine, and the implications of this dogma are based on assumed deep time, built into their evolutionary models, and arbitrary classification of hominid fossils. He did say, roughly, and creationists would argue that it's very rough indeed. He loads his statement with the phrase, ancestors of humans, as though it were fact and also as though it should not be questioned, but such hypotheses should always be questioned. These kinds of huge time frames imagined for humans are radically different to what the biblical time frames seem to be, believed to be a little over 6,000 years for the extant human species, so which idea is true? Whose interpretation of the fossil evidence is correct? And so, the theory states,
one should find a succession of hominid creatures, with features progressively less ape-like, and more modern, which is indeed what the fossil record shows. But one should not, and does not, find modern human fossils embedded in strata from the Jurassic period, 144 million years ago. Evolutionary biology routinely makes predictions far more refined and precise than this, and researchers test them constantly.
And may they continue testing them constantly, because there has been much conjecture over which fossils are human, and which fossils are ape. If evolutionary biology routinely makes predictions far more refined and precise than this, then we would require specific examples for us to consider. We want to analyze evidence, not sweeping opinions. The facts are clear. There is no obvious progression in the fossil record, even further back in the record, but instead what is known as the Cambrian explosion, and an observed punctuated equilibrium, and these phenomena have not been adequately explained by science, only lots of guesswork, and many paleontologists are aware of the absence of the types of bones that would be needed to exist in order to prove gradualism. There seems to be a deficiency of the believed types of bones that would be required to support the idea of gradualism in the fossil record, which is what the terms Cambrian explosion and punctuated equilibrium tacitly acknowledge. There is dispute from some scientists regarding this as well, because of certain fossil discoveries, which secular science has chosen to ignore, simply because it doesn't conform to the Darwinian model. The biblical model in Genesis also agrees that humans came last, after monkeys, and all other animals. So, this agrees with some aspects of the sequence, just not the posited time frame. There is no conclusive evidence in the fossil record that disproves the biblical model, that monkeys and humans are separate creations, based on common design principles. It is important to recognize that all dating techniques have assumptions built into them, which affects the answer that they give. Many of them might be correct, who knows for sure? Not only creationists or evolutionists, but scientists in general, you would hope, would often question the dating methods that are employed to test something. Experiments have been done, which reveal just how flawed various methods of dating things can be, in certain situations. Some labs will quite often not want to submit to blind tests, using decoy control samples, where the hoped for age of them is known to the scientist, but not to those doing the tests. If we are skeptical, it is reasonable to wonder whether at least some scientists will not send decoy control samples, with their other samples, covertly to a lab, because of their ideological hubris, and also due to conflict of interest. That is, not wanting to jeopardize the funding of their research. And yet a rational unbiased scientist should rightfully expect a scientist to have a covert control subject in his samples, in order to be rigorous, not putting too much faith in the dating method used. One must therefore be skeptical when these situations arise. Are those scientists humble enough to allow such scrutiny of their methodology? How transparent are the documents in this regard? Is the one doing the testing allowed to know the posited age of what it is that they are testing, or just the sample numbers? How much cherry-picking is involved? How much oversight is in the process, so that there are proper checks and balances, to prevent manipulation of the process, so that the testing may therefore be unbiased and blind? Is it in the financial interests of those who oversee the business to stop any manipulation of the process? It would be unfortunate for the scientific profession if scientists were able to go doctor shopping. He now admits
evolution could be disproved in other ways too. If we could document the spontaneous generation of just one complex life form, from inanimate matter, then at least a few creatures seen in the fossil record might have originated this way.
yes, that would prove it. This is the primary form of proof needed. That would be the proper scientific method for such. That is exactly the evidence that serious scientists would require to prove abiogenesis a scientific fact. However, spontaneous generation has so far never been observed to happen, but repeatedly shown not to happen, at least in all experiments thus far, which, in the minds of many scientific people, already casts appropriate doubt about any abiogenesis idea being plausible. Others also see it as a falsification of the idea, not just the empirical evidence or lack thereof, but also when examining it at the theoretical level using models, although incomplete, to show the mathematical improbabilities of spontaneous generation ever occurring in the entire theoretically understood history of the universe. The models only take into account smaller portions of the overall complexity of the problem. But he goes on to say,
if superintelligent aliens appeared and claimed credit for creating life on Earth, or even particular species, the purely evolutionary explanation would be cast in doubt. But no one has yet produced such evidence.
It has been argued many times that there are far more realistic reasons for why evolutionary explanations about the origins of various life forms should be cast in doubt. And so his type of reasoning is strange. Observational experimental evidence for spontaneous generation is realistically required, and yet it's unusual, maybe even bizarre, to think that perhaps demanding the appearance of aliens as evidence would be a realistic requirement to scientifically prove intelligent design and falsify evolutionary explanations, or for protecting the poorly imagined ideal scenario of a spontaneous generation. This reasoning is backward and upside down. There is a psychological component here. He may be subtly alluding to the question of why we have not yet seen or heard God more directly, more instantly, and more presently, or seen some sort of miraculous occurrence, or divine intervention yet, and why evil and suffering is currently allowed to exist in the world at this time. So, he is attempting to shift the burden of proof onto the creationists, but that is not the scientific method required here. The burden of proof is on the atheists. The fact that the functional specified complexity exists in many things, and not just total entropy everywhere, can most likely be considered miraculous, from a scientific standpoint, due to the immutable repeatable laws of thermodynamics. The onus is on the evolutionists to prove and document spontaneous generation and macroevolution, or to explain how one could have a method that would satisfy their way of thinking, of trying to falsify this extraordinary claim, according to how they see the scientific way of substantiation, for it to be a valid argument in the commonly professed mainstream orthodoxy of scientific methods. This has not been accomplished by the evolutionists. If we assume that abiogenesis and macroevolution are false, and perhaps we are alone in the universe, and you have not accepted the experimental evidence so far, then how do you try and falsify abiogenesis, or the macroevolution concept, which have been supposedly rescued by the ad hoc, lots of time needed for it to happen hypothesis? Do you have a proper understanding of the second law of thermodynamics? The ball is in the evolutionists' court, but the writer here is deviating from the rules of skepticism, and trying to lob it into the court of the intelligent design advocates. The burden of proof, and the confirmation of adherence to a traditionally accepted methodology, rests with the Darwinian evolutionists, or anyone else who makes a knowledge claim. After all, they are the ones who often make extraordinary claims about non-intelligent order from chaos, and everything evolving from fluctuation, and then some who claim it as an established fact. One would demand the evidence for this to be inexcusable, before giving their entire allegiance to the concept of mindless, upward, transformations. For the sake of consistency, everyone needs to play by the same rules,